Kevin Deal here, and on today's episode, we are going to explore as to whether or not the Canon RF28-70 f2 replaces your prime lenses. Okay, so I've been seeing on YouTube, I've been seeing in Canon groups on Facebook, people making the claim that, oh, you just need to go out and buy the RF28-70 and it will replace your prime lenses. People say that it replaces your 28mm, your 35mm, your 50mm, and your 85mm. So let's take a deeper dive and see if that's actually true. So we're actually going to take these and do real-world tests with them. I want to do some environmental portraits in addition to doing some studio photography. I don't want to do too technical of a review because there's already some great reviews of these lenses. There are plenty of YouTube personalities out there who actually do lens reviews much better than I will as far as the technical aspects. I just want to really try them out in real-world environments and see how they actually work on my projects. Okay, so we're at a cool gym here in downtown Austin, Texas, and I'm going to be working with David, and we're going to be testing out the 28-70 f2 along with the 35 1.8 and the 50 1.2 and the 85 1.2. So let's give a brief overview of the 28-70 f2. Obviously, the maximum aperture size is f2. It's a very hefty 1,430 grams or 3.15 pounds. If you're sensitive to weight and you do really long events all day, this is not the lens for you, as it will get very heavy very quickly. And speaking of heavy, let's talk price. $3,099 in the US. Additionally, if you decide to get filters for it, it has a 95mm filter thread. That's a really expensive filter. You're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 just for a UV filter. So comparing the RF28-70 to Canon's RF28mm prime, well, there is no RF28mm prime. It doesn't exist at the time of this recording. So you can say that yes, if you don't want to carry around a 28mm prime, the RF28-70 could replace your 28mm prime. So here's some examples I took with the 28-70 at 28mm. I personally don't feel like I need a 28mm prime and that it replaces it, but there very well may be some of you out there who need that extra stop of light. Unfortunately, there are no 28mm primes in the RF mount, so you're going to have to go with third-party options like Sigma. Okay, so here's the 35mm RF 1.8, which is $499 retail. Sometimes you can find it for $399. It weighs in at 10.565 ounces and 299 grams. So this lens is incredibly light, incredibly small. I use it for street photography. It has image stabilization, which is pretty awesome. And it does technically let in more light than the 28-70. So does the 28-70 replace it? Well, you're talking about a $3,200 lens versus a $500 lens. So from a money standpoint, I don't know if it would do that for a lot of people. When I do a portrait shoot, though, I definitely will leave my 35mm at home and take the 28-70 because it's more versatile, and I find that their image quality is pretty close in my personal opinion. If you're a street photographer and you want to keep things light, I would opt for the 35mm. I think that it does just a fine job. Now, there are two things that bug me about the 35. One is that it's very bad in low lighting situations. It focus hunts, which I'm not a fan of. From an image quality standpoint, if you're shooting wide open at backlit subjects, it'll produce a ton of chromatic aberration with purple and green fringing. But overall, I would say that the image quality between the 28-70 and the 35 is pretty close. And don't forget, the 35 does macro, which the 28-70 does not. This has actually come in handy on weddings. And while I'm trying to mainly compare their image quality with stills, I do want to point out that the 35 is a gem with videography. It's super light. You can run and gun with it. It has the image stabilization built in. So keep that in mind if you shoot videos. So whether or not the 28-70 replaces your 35mm prime, it just depends on your situation. While the 35 is not an L lens, it does punch above its weight class overall. And I would consider it one of the best values in the whole RF lineup. Moving on to the 50mm, this guy weighs in at 33.4 ounces and 945 grams. It's right at 2 pounds. Now, it comes in at $2,300, which is quite a bit of money. However, the 28-70 is $3,200. Does the 28-70 replace the 50mm? It depends on the situation, but if you like to shoot wide open and you like bokeh, well, 1.2 is going to give you quite a considerable amount more than f2 is going to give you. So I would argue that if you like to shoot wide open, no, the 28-70 is not going to replace your 50mm. Now, there are situations where I would absolutely use the 28-70 over the 50, one of them being at weddings during the ceremony. I don't like to change lenses during the ceremony because I might miss something important. These shots were literally taken 5 seconds apart. And frankly, even though I shoot at 50 a lot at ceremonies, being able to zoom into 70 and zoom back to 28 just gives me so much versatility. And with that in mind, I absolutely think that the 28-70 is a better lens than the 50 if you're a wedding photographer. Also, maybe if you shoot like family portraits, you're shooting kids running around out in fields, f2 still lets in quite a bit of light, and I think it'll be just fine for that particular photographer. But does it replace the 50mm? For me, in some instances it does. For you, it may replace it completely, and in other instances, it may not replace it at all. Okay, let's talk the 85mm, which weighs in at 1,195 grams or 2.63 pounds. And this lens retails for $2,800. Now, my opinion of this lens to me is the finest lens that Canon makes, period. If you're going to ask me if I think that the 28-70 replaces my 85, I'm going to say no, it does not replace it at all. Shooting 85mm at 1.2 is one of the most special looking things you can get as a portrait photographer. It absolutely produces stunning bokeh in the background. The other thing to keep in mind is 70mm is not 85. And just in case you didn't know this, when you buy a lens and it says that it's an 85mm, that's an approximation. The manufacturer doesn't make it specifically to exactly 85. The 1.2 really comes in at about 87mm, so it's a little longer than 85. And now if you take something that's 87mm and you compare it to something that's 70mm, around 70mm, there's a pretty big difference. Especially when you have busy backgrounds and you're trying to get the bokeh, 1.2 to f2, and then you add another 15 to 17mm, yeah, it's going to compress things more. It's going to make the bokeh balls bigger. So no, there's no comparison between those two lenses in that particular situation. Talking about a studio photographer, I don't typically shoot 28 and 35 in the studio, but I do shoot 50. I think that as a studio photographer who typically lives between f8 and f11, I don't think I'd ever take the 50mm into the studio if I had the 28-70 on me, because when you stop it down, the differences between the lenses, they're a lot closer as far as look. Now 85, when you're doing things like headshots, the difference between 70 and 85, and in this case if it's more like 87-ish, are pretty noticeable. Even when you're stopped down and you don't have a busy background, the perspective it does on the face, the distortion, I would still have the 85. As far as the looks, and this is completely subjective and this is just my opinion, if I were a salesperson for Canon, I would say, oh, the 28-70 is so amazing looking. Everything you take looks like it belongs in a magazine. It just has a very nice editorial look. I use it all the time when I shoot editorials, and it's just a fantastic lens. Now, as far as the 85 and the 50s are concerned, my sales pitch line for the 85 and the 50 is that everything you take on these lenses look like they belong hanging on a wall. They're very artistic, they're very surgical, they're just really beautiful looking lenses. Now, that's all just subjective. That doesn't mean that you can't shoot editorials on the primes or you can't do something artsy on the 28-70. It's just kind of my impressions when I use the lenses, what I'm thinking about. I would say that if you can't afford all the primes and you want the 28-70 to genuinely do a good job in most circumstances, it could replace these primes for you. I still think that the 85, it's kind of a stretch. You can't just take a picture at 70 and crop it and expect it to look exactly like an 85. Maybe your client won't notice, maybe your client won't care, but it bothers me, so I would have to have the 85. The way I started out, I bought the 85 first because it just had the look. Then I bought the 28-70. Then the other two lenses came later because I didn't find them as important. But that's just what I do. Thanks for checking out my video today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button below, and I would appreciate it. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.